name is Irene Zikas, and I'll be your host for today's session. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Todd Redwood may not be able to join us today. In the spirit of reconciliation, BSI Group acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Thank you for joining us. You're currently in listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to participate throughout the webinar by submitting your questions using the question box. We'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. And any unanswered questions will be followed up after the webinar. And a recording of today's session will also be shared with all attendees. Next slide, please, Lee. And please bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. We'll work to resolve them quickly. Today's webinar will explore the evolving challenges and opportunities shaping the future of food systems, including resilience, sustainability, supply chain transparency, food safety, and stakeholder trust. I'm now pleased to introduce today's presenters, Lee and Tony. Next slide, please. Lee is the founder of Synthesis, a creative data consultancy in Singapore, New York, and London. Previously, Global Head of Digital Forensics at Omnicom Consultancy and at IBM Innovation Labs. Lee now leads Synthesis Future of Food series. Now, in its 5th year, the series runs 100,000 simulations of the world in the next decade to replace comfortable assumptions with uncomfortable clarity. Synthesis works with the world's biggest food and beverage brands, putting tropic, cell-cultured meat, air-derived protein, and mycelium to help explore the world and nutrition ahead. BSI's white paper, The Critical Decade, extends that research, examining what the global food system must do before 2035 to rethink how food is produced, rebuild soil health and consumer trust, and reimagine what we eat before the window to our closes. Tony is also joining us, and Tony has extensive experience conducting enterprise-level supply chain and security risk assessments for global organisations and their supply chain partners. As Director of BSI's Security and Resilience Consulting team, Tony supports clients in designing, implementing and refining mitigation programs that reduce loss diversion and counterfeiting, strengthening operational security and lowering overall supply chain risk across global operations. He's also designed and delivered risk management, loss prevention, security business continuity and inventory assessment programs, including mapping and assessing supply chain and security risks for the Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries. In addition, Tony has supported the successful implementation of risk and inventory management plans, policies and procedures. I'll now hand over to Lee to begin today's presentation.
Thank you and good morning. So I'm Lee, I'm one of the co-founders of Synthesis, and we help future-proof business by making sense of the world's data for major food and drink businesses, for example, Zespri, Mars, Kerry, PepsiCo, Mondelez, and Guinness. And today, I'll be sharing some of the most important contextual factors that fed into the study we collaborated with BSI, exploring our future food and food futures 2035. We'll talk about the factors that we can be confident will shape the future of food here in Australia and globally, both the operating conditions that will shape the future of our businesses, but also the things that will shape all of our future diets too. So with that introduction, let's start with these guys, pet strollers. In Korea, some of you might know this, but pet strollers have outsold baby strollers since 2023, and the gap is actually widening. In Japan, adult diapers have outsold baby diapers now for over a decade, and manufacturers like OG Holdings have actually stopped making baby diapers for the domestic market. I find stats like this fascinating because they sound funny, they take us by surprise, but they actually represent something real, and that is the pervasively lower fertility that's happening all around the world and the rapidly aging population. What does that have to do with the future of food? Well, it affects everything, the sorts of food people want to eat, packaging format, rising labor costs, more people eating at home, less people eating out, the role of automation, robotics, the demand for nutraceuticals, probiotic dairy, fortified food. It will shape government policy. So let's look at some of the data. This is Korea's population pyramid from 1975 on the left, and on the right, you'll see 2035. And as you can see, in places like Korea, population pyramids no longer look like pyramids. And that's because people are living longer and healthier lives and having less babies. The same is true in China and in Singapore, where I'm based, where in 2035, 1/3 of the population will be over 65. In Australia, aging population is a little bit slower than the examples we've just seen, but the population aged over 65 is expected to rise from where it is today, around 4.8 million, to 8 million within the next 20 years. And in other parts of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, places on the slide now we can see Nigeria, this change is taking hold much more slowly. In fact, we expect most of the population growth in the next 20 to 50 years to come from sub-Saharan Africa. So, because people are living longer, and even with lower fertility almost everywhere, the population will continue to grow for the next decade to around 8.9 billion by 2035 and over 10 billion by 2050. So by 2050, we'll need to feed 1.5 billion more people than we do today. And because of growing prosperity in the global south and overconsumption and waste in the global north, topics that we get into a lot of detail in the BSI paper, we're going to need to grow a lot more food. But growing food is getting harder. And I've got two examples on the page here. You've got steak in a cage, and this really represents the scarcity. In 2026 in the US, we've seen cattle herd drop to its lowest in 75 years, gutted by 4 straight years of drought. Retail beef hit just under $10 a pound, an all-time record, and the USDA is forecasting another 10 to 18% rise this year. And given that a calf takes nearly 2 years to reach market, even if the rain comes tomorrow, relief is years away. So we see prices raising and scarcity. And then the other example that I'm sure we're all familiar with on the right is a chocolate bar, but much smaller than it used to be. And that's off the back of late 2024, we saw cocoa hit an all-time high, nearly $13,000 a ton, 4 times higher than the average long-term price, after disease and erratic rain gutted West Africa's harvest. Prices have since come back down to around $3,200 a ton, but chocolate prices to the consumer haven't followed. Prices still track about 14% above the average last year. Manufacturers hedged at the top, shrunk the bars, swapped cocoa for cheaper fats. The crisis has since cooled significantly, but the bars remain small and the prices remain higher. And all of this is linked to above average temperatures now expected everywhere, every season. And we've seen that in Australia in January this year. Southeastern Australia hit 50 degrees. Victoria broke the state temperature record that had stood since 2009. And for the first time, the 3-year average temperatures have hit 1.5 degrees above average. And this is having major consequences on food, on beef, on chocolate, on the supply chain closer to home. These are topics that Tony's going to talk about next. But I think everyone working in our industry is feeling the enormous volatility recently. We've seen Australia's food inflation cool to 3.1%, but those averages really mask the category divergence. Beef and lamb inflation, for example, are above 12%, 4 times that headline rate. And the Strait of Hormuz fuel and fertilizer shock is only really just beginning to flow through. We see that coffee has just closed its 5th consecutive year of a global deficit. We're drinking more coffee than we're growing. New research published just this year in 2026 shows domesticated rice rarely thrives above 28 degrees medium average temperature. It's rarely thrived across 9,000 years of cultivation. And that threshold has been passed now in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and Japan's rice prices have jumped 28% in the last year alone. So, to meet this growing demand, we've leaned on intensive methods. monocropping, heavy fertilization, things that strip soil of its nutrients and long-term livingness, vitality. And whilst that quantity of crops has grown, the quality has plunged. And that's leading to less nutrition in our food. Many of the fruits and vegetables that we know and love have lost 25 to 50% of their key nutrients. Nutrients like iron, calcium, vitamin C are all down over the last 70 years. Wheat has lost 23% of its protein. And all of this is getting worse. Rising CO2 itself is now shown to reduce protein, zinc, iron in staple crops that we depend on. So the food of the future will be more calorific and less nourishing. And all of this is really important because it's leading to hidden hunger, where 1 in 4 people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies, especially vitamin A, iron and zinc. Today, nearly 3 billion people globally are already overweight or obese, and the current trends are expecting to rise to more than 4 billion people, nearly 51% of the population by 2035, according to the World Obesity Federation. And in Australia today, 66%, according to Australian Institute of Health and Wellness. And most concerningly, obesity is rising fastest with children and fastest still with girls. In Australia, 24% of 2 to 4-year-old girls are now living with overweight or obesity. And the same is true in the rapid rise of type 2 diabetes that we see here. So what does it all mean? It means that our food systems necessarily look very different in the next decade, the critical decade that this paper introduces. I've just talked for a moment around a handful of drivers that will change, that we monitor at Synthesis to help businesses prepare for what's coming and future-proof. We track hundreds of these drivers, and through modeling, we see how they're all connected. What do pet strollers have to do with crop yields? This is an enormously complex ecosystem, as you can imagine. But when you know the last 25 years of data, and you can see how all of these drivers are interconnected, and you can project out the next 10 years and see what could happen, that's what we've done for the research today. What we're sharing today, we modeled 100,000 simulations of what the world looks like in 2035. And what we found is that we'll most likely be living in one of two worlds in the next decade. The first is a world of radical transformation. This is where we protect and savor nature. We look after our soils, we eat more diverse ingredients, and we drastically reduce the waste that we produce today. This might sound unlikely because it's very difficult to get people to change their behavior. But it wasn't so long ago that traceability, plant-based diets, bioavailability, fermentation, full utilization, all of these ideas were considered niche. So we know that we can change. The second world that we'll likely be living in is a world of resilient adaptation. A world where we're slow to change, leaving a bigger and bigger food gap to fill. But as humans, we adapt. Science and technology replace diminishing ingredients. And in this world, governments will necessarily need to step in with greater regulation. And ironically, tobacco offers a source of optimism here because we have gotten control of tobacco. From a public policy point of view, there is a playbook in place where we make accessibility a lot harder, we increase taxes, we reduce marketing, we place warnings on pack, and we, in this world, should anticipate all of that is coming for food. And based on those 100,000 simulations of the future, we're most likely to be living in that world of resilient adaptation. In this world, far from pulling greenhouse gas emissions down, they'll increase another 21% on where they are today. So, when working in the future of food, it often feels like a crisis, like everything's going against us, particularly at the moment, with constraints just piling up on top of each other. But that's not what we're here to set up today. That's not what we want to do. We believe that the conversation, forums like this one today, can help shape a different future. And that's why we want to spend the rest of the time today, because if there's one thing that was consistently true when you have a lot of constraints, it is that constraints inspire creativity. And that really is the essence of the white paper, Food Futures 2035, where we explore all of this context. And we explore it through the three lens of the three biggest impact pillars that will shape the future of food. So in the paper, which you can download, and I think it's being shared out as well, you can look at how we source food differently. We discuss alternative proteins, we discuss regenerative agriculture and food sovereignty. We dig into how do we stretch the food that we have, looking at circular valorization, waste reduction, and different AI solutions that are coming into play. And we look at how do we increase sustenance? How do we restore nutrition, look at personalization? How do we adapt to a world of GLP-1s and scientific breakthroughs? And this last one, how do we increase sustenance, is actually the new and recently launched our 2-year research focus on the world in 27 and the world in 2037, which I'll be sharing more about in Melbourne in September. So do get in touch if you're interested in super nutrition. That's a big focus for us coming up, to dig even further into this topic of how do we increase sustenance. So the paper looks at how do we source food differently, how do we stretch the food that we have, and how do we increase sustenance. You can read more about all of those topics by downloading the white paper. I will now pass to Tony to take us into the detail on what this looks like from a supply chain perspective.
Great, thank you, Lee. If we could just pop the slides up here. So as Lee said, I think what we'll be talking mostly about is how do we sort of see that future of resilient adaptation. So basically adapting to a world where we are doing more sort of intensive farming, more intensive agriculture in order to sort of meet disruptors, seeing things like geopolitics, like regulatory shifts and tariffs, larger sort of cyclical and structural changes like climate change, especially for the food industry, can have an impact not just on sort of the length of growing seasons or seasonality in ingredients, but also on perishability as freight or cargo moves through hotter areas. You may see sort of shorter storage times, and supply chains will become even more attenuated. Of course, consumer expectations are changing as well. They want more variety more quickly, as Lee covered as well. And sort of growing and wealthier populations will want more and different types of food. And as people live longer, their needs for food will change as well. So that impacts a lot of the things that we're already seeing in terms of challenges across the supply chain. It increases that variability that you see in the supply chain. With an extended supply chain, you have more possibility that something can go wrong. You have difficulty of scaling any of your efforts across the supply chain. And then, of course, you're increasing the complexity as well throughout the supply chain. What we still see, though, is that a lot of companies are set up to sort of look at that supply chain risk in silos. So they're looking at it just from a procurement perspective, just from a supply chain perspective, just from a logistics perspective, moving things from point A to point B. Or they're looking at sort of demand forecasting as something separate from the rest of their supply chain. And they're not really seeing how all of those feed into sort of their challenges across the risk landscape. So we feel like that this will make the sort of approaches that they're currently using much more difficult in a world that's sort of much less predictable, and much hotter, with weather that's much more extreme. It will make it more difficult for companies to sort of have any type of predictability or risk management in their supply chains, especially with the way that they are currently set up. So if you could go on to the next slide. How do companies begin to start to deal with that sort of variability and that sort of unpredictability? Give me just a second. The other thing too is that the range of risks that companies are looking at is much broader than it used to be. So now they're looking at things, as Lee said, like traceability of their food supply chain, like waste and circularity in the food supply chains, like general concerns about sustainability, the health, safety, and well-being of workers in the supply chain, things like environmental risk management, legal compliance in the different countries that they're sourcing from, working hours and conditions all through the supply chain, whether that's driven by consumer demand or by regulatory factors. There's a whole host of things that didn't need to be considered as recently as 10, 15, or 20 years ago in the supply chain that now need to be considered on top of all these risks that we previously did not see in food or really any other supply chains. So if we can go on to the next slide, how do companies begin to sort of think about the best ways to sort of manage those supply chains? Well, most of them, what they do is they tend to be fairly reactive to those risks. So they're looking at things like, something bad happens and we begin to sort of do something about it. There's a break in the supply chain where there's disruption in the supply chain somewhere, only then do we think about it. Then what we tend to see is the companies may become more proactive, where they start mapping out some of the risks in their supply chain. They begin looking at sort of second or third level traceability for their supply chain. They begin thinking about how they build capacity in their suppliers, in their business partners, and internally in their organization. They start planning out how to better do strategic audits and assessments of their supply chain to prevent some of those risks. And then eventually they'll move to best practice, which is where they sort of are able to really dig in on some of the root causes of those risks. And they'll be able to do sort of the type of sophisticated horizon scanning that Lee talked about. So not thinking about just what will happen in the next growing season, but what will happen 3, 4, 5, or 10 growing seasons from now, and dig in on the types of supply chains that they would need in order to sort of better meet those challenges in the next 5 or 10 years, begin organizing their procurement and sourcing strategies around those types of risks. And then be able to do a more comprehensive risk assessment and improve the process and automate a lot of the processes that they use in order to manage risk in the supply chain. So that's what we see a lot of the most advanced companies doing. So if we could go to the next slide, it'll probably be a couple clicks because there's some animation, but I've sort of talked through all of these already. So that's the good path, basically, moving from a sort of more reactive way of managing risk in the supply chain into a more proactive one. But what we sometimes see is companies fall into what we call the fragmentation trap. So they tend to respond to a single issue in a single way. If we can go on to the next slide, please. They tend to respond to an issue in sort of a single issue with a single way. So okay, we have an issue with let's say disruption in the supply chain or extreme weather in the supply chain. Great, we're going to deal with just that challenge, and we're going to give it to one person within the organization or within the company to deal with. We need to do more and better traceability on our supply chain or the ingredients in our supply chain. Great, we'll have a traceability team that works on that challenge. What happens over time, however, and as we've seen what happens over the past 10 or 15 years, is that creates very sort of reactive and siloed efforts with duplicative programs. You have multiple people within the organization doing the same or similar thing. There's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different groups or initiatives that are all working on different risks or issues in the supply chains, and none of them are very forward-looking. They're all tend to have short time horizons. They're looking at things the next 1 or 2 years instead of in the next 5 or 10 years. And as a result, they're not looking at those kind of mega trends that Lee mentioned that could expose them to operational expense, reputational harm, regulatory liability, and ultimately a loss of their customer or consumer base. So we've surveyed this a bit, and most of the companies that we surveyed said that they had a lack of sort of defined ownership of supply chain risk, a relatively low level of that risk awareness, except for the areas that they were immediately working in, and then a skills gap. They weren't able to sort of articulate the types of challenges that Lee outlined and how they impact the company, or how they would better manage the supply chain in order to manage those types of risks. We see similar challenges as well as it relates to business continuity. If you could go on to the next slide. Where we see with business continuity planning, which is sort of thought as of the way to sort of hedge against these types of risks, especially the more sort of climate-related risks or weather-related risks, we'll just put together a business continuity plan. The business continuity plan is typically only looking narrowly at a single site or a single series of sites, and it just answers the question, what do we do when we can't operate from this site? We'll find an alternate site, we'll have this site back up and running in 2 to 3 days, 2 to 3 hours, however long it may be. What we instead need to start asking now, and is that things like the closure of the Strait of Hormuz have started making a lot of companies realize, is that your supply chain is not just a series of disconnected sites, literally in the name supply chain, but I think people don't really think about it in that sense. How does climate change impact where we source, where we manufacture, how we deliver? How does a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, for example, change where we source, how we manufacture our product, and how we deliver if it's been sort of structurally destabilized, if there's a new or changing environment in which we can't reliably deliver in the way that we used to? they're not really the same question. It's not just is one site down, it's is the whole system down, is the whole system changing in such a way that we can no longer rely on the same sort of steady stream of supply and reliability that we have over the past 10 or 15 years. So a traditional approach won't really work anymore. We need to have instead a sort of more structured or a different type of structured framework. If you go on to the next slide, in order to manage these types of risks, 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, or even 2 months from now, as we're seeing with things like the Strait of Hormuz. So a traditional business impact analysis or traditional business continuity plan would ask questions like, how long can we tolerate the loss of this supplier or this manufacturing plant? How quickly can we get it back up and running? What systems, whether it's IT or others, does this process depend on? Who are the key people that manage that process? Instead, we should be asking questions that are much broader. Where does the input to this process originate? What are its geographic routing dependencies? Or even questions as broad as sort of, are our suppliers able to provide the products, ingredients that our consumers are asking for or that they need? So what we propose instead is a structured framework for thinking about this type of risk that will help sort of look at these sort of over the horizon risks in a different way than what we're traditionally doing. And we call it MESH, which stands for Mapping, Evaluation, Strategy, and Harmonization. So building basically, if you go on to the next slide, an understanding of what your current processes look like, taking a look at all those siloed processes for managing risk in the supply chain, organizing a bit better to maybe take sort of a whole of business approach or enterprise approach to managing those types of risks, not just the ones that you're seeing today, but the ones that you'll see in 5 or 10 years, responding to those types of changes that Lee has mentioned. Look at sort of mapping out the risk in the supply chain to your second and third or fourth tier in the supply chain, doing audits at those sites in the supply chain, and then designing improvement plans and ongoing monitoring around those different types of risks. So I'll talk through just a little bit about what that looks like for each different part of the supply chain and food supply chains in particular. So if we go on to the next slide, that sort of mapping is not just about really putting dots down on a map or saying, hey, we're able to trace back to the second or third tier of the supply chain. It is also about knowing where those kind of high-risk sourcing regions are, not just right now, but what will be a high-risk sourcing region in 3 or 4 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. If there's a sudden spike in demand for a certain type of ingredient or a certain type of ingredient or commodity becomes more expensive, what does that mean for your supplier base? And then also really importantly, within your own business, who owns the data around those suppliers, commodity prices, the impact that that has on the supply chain, and how can that be made more legible across your organization? This is an area where I feel like AI will have a major impact in making this information that currently sits in silos more sort of legible across your organization. But in order to do that, you need to have a plan in terms of what do we want to look at, what types of inputs will be most relevant to help us with the risks that not just are relevant today, but will be relevant in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years from now, and understand those dependencies in your supply chain. So from there, once you've got a good picture of your internal processes and your external supply chain, if we go on to the next slide, you can start to sort of score and prioritize those risks across the supply chain. So like I said, even with AI, you can't do it all. Your suppliers don't all carry equal risk. They're not all responding to the same types of risks or exposures. And your effort should reflect the differences in your organization's supply, quality, compliance, and operational exposure and expertise, and your supplier's exposure to those things as well. So what you should do here is sort of call out independent or individual quality, compliance, and performance signals that you're seeing with different suppliers. Highlight their sort of operational constraints and control gaps. Do you need to consider new or different suppliers based on that analysis? And then reinforce that alignment across sort of your key quality, compliance, and operations functions. So as I mentioned before, quality may just be dealing with sort of quality issues, compliance dealing with regulatory issues. They may be working together, but only when there's an issue or an incident. Instead, that all needs to become part of sort of your day-to-day operation. Build that into how you manage risk or how you manage the operation on a regular basis. Next, you should think about the strategy for managing some of that. So moving from sort of just assessment to proactive sort of engagement with your suppliers on food safety, quality training, supplier capacity building, and capability building, and alternative sourcing strategies. Again, this is something that most people in the food industry are already fairly familiar with. But again, it needs to be extended a bit further. So not just sort of the next 3 months, the next 6 months, but something that goes out to a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. How are you integrating this into your product development cycle? How are you integrating it into your overall supplier selection criteria? How are you thinking about this when you're contracting with suppliers as you're onboarding them? Are you vetting them for different types of their ability to manage different types of supply chain risks? Are you looking at this for all different parts of your supply chain? So not just ingredient sourcing or commodity sourcing, you're looking at it for packaging and integrating that into your ingredient supply plans. If there's a 20% increase in the cost of this particular input and ingredient, what does that do to your supply plans? What does that do to your supplier base? And what does it ultimately do to what you're able to deliver to customers on the shelf? Again, keeping that in mind, so taking the information that you have, the levers that you have, both sort of internally and externally, the strategy and sort of prioritization that you have of those risks to build that into sort of your everyday operations. So if we go sort of to the next slide or next step, don't do this as a sort of one-off thing. A lot of the risks and major changes to the industry that Lee is talking about, they're not going to happen all at once. They're going to happen sort of over time or in fits and starts. It'll be, and I think we've seen that quite a bit actually with climate change, is that everybody's thinking, well, it'll be a 20, 30-year problem. That's absolutely true. But what we're seeing is this sort of like disjunctive shift and shock in terms of, okay, now there's a lot more extreme weather in this one part of the world. There's a lot more heat or stress on crops in this other part of the world. And that happens very quickly because you have these kind of climate feedback loops that are continuously feeding into those types of issues. So none of these are going to be really one-off issues that you can just deal with and then be done. Similarly, your risk management strategy can't be a one-off as well. Those types of one-off strategies always fail. They don't scale for your changing business. So if your business is changing fundamentally in response to these trends, your risk management strategy needs to change as well. And if it's a one-off, you won't be able to then drive improvement in that risk management process either. So it needs to be embedded into every part of your business. And those risks change daily, not quarterly. So you need to think about how they change on a daily basis, and how they could then change. Those daily changes could translate into monthly, quarterly, yearly, and even beyond the first 1, 2, or 3 years. So thinking about sort of both the commodity volatility and climate impacts on crop availability and cost, what does that mean for you today? But also, what does it mean for your sourcing strategies as you go forward? What does it mean for your supplier management strategies going forward? Is risk something you could incorporate into your regular reviews with your suppliers? And then also you need to make the case internally as well. Compliance and quality may work well on specific sort of functional issues, but they should be working on supply chain risk management more regularly and as almost a matter of course, as part of their sort of day-to-day operation. Unfortunately, given the world that we live in, supply chain risk management isn't something that just ends, and sort of that business continuity management isn't something that just ends once the issue is gone. As Lee laid out in the first half of this presentation, there's going to be a series of sort of long-term, larger changes to the world around us that mean that these types of issues won't really go away. So I think Lee talked about sort of what's happening in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm mostly talking about what's happening in the next 3 to 5 years, how you can prepare for those sort of things. But I think one thing that's tough coming out of a webinar like this or a presentation like this is, well, what do we do tomorrow, basically? What can I start doing now in order to sort of respond to these types of changes? So what I wanted to close with before we move into questions is just a couple of practical takeaways and just sort of things that you can actually do this week, basically. So as we progress through this week, what can you do to begin to address these challenges now that you know sort of the trends that are coming over the next 10 or 15 years, and you have our view on sort of what a good supply chain risk management looks like? Where do you actually start? So the first thing is to basically do an audit of your current risk management programs and look particularly at fragmentation. Where is there fragmentation in the data about your supply chain? And where do you have organizational silos and duplications? Do you have efforts with your quality team that would also be useful for your compliance team? Are there things that are happening in procurement or onboarding of suppliers that would also be useful for a risk management team? Are there things that you're doing in terms of your product development, your supply chain planning, your ingredient planning, for example, your hedging for commodity costs, where you could use some of that to sort of better manage supply chain risk on a day-to-day basis? So think through sort of where are those silos and duplications in your organizations, and importantly as well, where is the data on your supply chain and your suppliers within your organization also? So Second would be sort of map your highest risk spend categories against multiple risk categories. So think about some of the things that Lee and I have been talking about, especially things like climate change, for example. Take your highest spend suppliers and map them against multiple risks. So first, think about maybe shorter term geopolitical risk. Second, think about longer term climate risk. Third, maybe think about sort of more slowly changing consumer expectations or consumer purchasing patterns. Is that supplier, are those high spend suppliers sort of insulated against those risks? What would the impact be on those 3, 4, 5 highest spend suppliers that you have of those multiple risk categories? And if 3 or 4 of those risks were to come to fruition or were to have some impact on them all at once, would they be okay? Or what would they do, basically? And if you don't know the answer to that question, then you should probably be asking them what they would do or figuring out if they have the capacity and capability to deal with those types of issues. And then my third recommendation is just to basically make a friend. Identify one stakeholder within your business that you aren't currently working with to begin aligning around a shared risk framework. So for example, if you work in supply chain, find somebody in procurement that you can work with. If you work in product development, find somebody in supply chain that you can work with, and begin asking them sort of what part of their function is involved in managing risk. A lot of times what happens is that supply chain risk is a bit of an orphan until it becomes a huge problem, then it's everybody's problem. So you have this problem of sort of there's no focus, no resource around it, and then there's too many cooks in the kitchen. We would want to be somewhere in between, basically, where most groups or most parts of the business are integrating supply chain risk management into their everyday. And I'll just close by saying that the sort of trends that Lee talked about are not going away. They're going to become more and more important to the sort of everyday operation of every business in the food industry and most businesses just more broadly. So it's important to start thinking about how you begin sort of adapting your business to those issues. Most companies, I would guess, are sort of going to take that path of resilient adaptation, and their supply chains need to sort of follow along with that as well. And we've tried to present a picture here of sort of what that might look like, but there's definitely these concrete things that you can start doing right now to begin sort of future-proofing your organization for these types of risks and trends. So I will stop there if there's any questions, and thank you, Todd, for joining.
Yeah, look, can you hear me okay? Yep, good, okay. Yeah, apologies for everyone that I was so late. Unfortunately, just one of the issues with travel. I'm on my way to London and one of my connections became late this morning. So, but yeah, I appreciate the time that Lee and Tony have given this morning. I've heard both of them present before, not exactly on this that they did today, but I know that they're really wonderful presenters and thought-provoking. I know that we've already got a question that's come in, or a couple of questions that have come in actually. So one of them is, I guess generally, Lee and Tony, are there any specific challenges or opportunities for Australian food businesses compared to their global peers? So just, I guess, looking at that very Australia-centric versus the rest of the globe. Anyone want to jump on that, Tony or Lee?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. I think for Australia specifically, one thing that we're seeing with a lot of the sort of current geopolitical issues is that Australia tends to be maybe more dependent than others on energy from overseas. So that I think is maybe one of the key challenges that Australian food producers will face, will be an increase in energy prices. They'd be more sensitive to those sort of increases in energy prices than a supplier, let's say, in the United States or South America, for example. So that would be one thing to look out for Australia specifically. And then the other thing is lead times as well in the supply chain. Lead times will just be a bit longer for Australia than they would for other suppliers, or sorry, for other countries. So what you would see is that the types of shocks in the supply chain may take a bit longer to reach Australia than other countries, but they would probably be more severe once they arrive. So plan that into sort of your supply chain risk management planning, that there may be a bit more of a lead time, but those impacts will be more severe when they do occur.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Anything to add there, Lee, or leave that one alone?
Sure. I think it would add the same point, and then obviously, like We talked a lot about the challenges of climate, and obviously in Australia, the most rain-fed major agricultural economy in the world means that we're just uniquely exposed to different ENSO swings. And so I think this is the biggest divergence from the global narrative, is most countries can't blame climate change in the abstract, but Australia can name it very specifically in the weather system as well. So we see that, and then we see the impact and feel the impact much more uniquely, I think, or more of a postcard from the future. A lot of the time is happening first in Australia.
Great, thanks, thank you, Lee. Just a note for everyone who's listening now. There's a little question mark box on the platform that we're presenting on if you want to type a question in there. So just hit the question mark box and type a question in there. We can pick them up. I've got another one for you, Lee. So Emil from End Food Waste Australia is asking that out of the 100,000 simulations, what were the principal components leading to your conclusion that will end up with one of the two worlds that you presented?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the simulation is based on last 25 years of data across 200 different impact drivers, and those range from lots of different things. Like, we started the conversation obviously with declining fertility and aging population. That has an impact, of course, on things like pickers and like essentially the number of people who are ready and able to work, which has an impact on lots of a number of different factors. So we can look at those kind of things. We also looked at climate and the impact of climate, use of fertilization, soil health, nutrition, and all of those sort of factors on how much we're able to produce. So we're actually looking at 200 different drivers of change and how they're all interacting. And we then use a simulation called Monte Carlo simulation. So we introduce randomness amongst those scenarios to see in lots of different scenarios, where do you start getting clusters that are consistent? And in this case, we had two very consistent clusters, the world of resilient adaptation and the world of radical transformation. And I think both of those had a really interesting, like, to the point coming from a waste focus as well. Both of them had a really interesting perspective on waste, and some really interesting examples that we share in the paper itself. In a world of radical transformation, for example, I think we share the example of Endless Foods, and a company founded in Copenhagen by Matt Orlando, one of the chefs behind a head chef of Noma previously, and they made chocolate called This Isn't Chocolate, and their base for that was brewers' spent grains, typically being left over after beer is brewed, makes up 85% of the brewing industry's waste system. And in a world of radical transformation, they've turned that into a cocoa replacement, and it bakes, it tastes, it melts, it tastes almost in every account like the real thing. And they were able to create and sell thick, rolled out in, I think, 180 different 7-Elevens in Denmark, replacing chocolate chips from their best-selling Tim's cookie. They replaced it with this thick chocolate alternative made from brewers' spent grains, and consumers didn't notice the difference. So we build out these scenarios, and then we look in those scenarios, what are the early examples of brands that or businesses doing something that shows real viability. And that was an interesting example from that. So I can talk through some of those different examples as well, but hopefully that gives you a sense of all of the different inputs that come in, and then how we get different clusters of scenarios. And in this case, we had two divergent worlds that we're most likely to go towards.
Thanks, Lee. It's really fascinating. I love the whole scenarios. I was really inspired when I met you first last year in Melbourne when you were speaking there. Irene, I think you've got something that you wanted to share just as a poll, just to get a sense from our participants
Yes,
today.
we do. Thank you, Lee and Tony, for the presentation. Your perspectives have made today's session incredibly worthwhile, and we do have a poll, so we will launch that. And yeah, if you could let us know if there's anything that we can do to help you and support you build a more resilient and trusted food system within your organisation, please let us know, and we will yeah, reach out to you after the webinar. So thank you. And I'm assuming that there are no other questions or comments that we have. So
Any parting thoughts from Tony or Lee?
No, just appreciate the time from everyone today, and it was great speaking with everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and also thanks so much, Lee, for your time with this today. There are a couple of links that have been shared out. The recording of the session will be sent out, but if you don't receive it for whatever reason as a participant, please reach out to our marketing email address. And of course, there's also more information available about this in the Future Food 2035 page on the BSI website. I think both of those links are made available there. And of course, through synthesis as well. We're not talking about 2035 now, you're talking about 2037, I think, Lee. So I think we're certainly looking a long way ahead. So if any more questions come through now, Irene, otherwise.
No, we don't. So we've now come to the end of today's webinar. So yeah, again, I'd like to thank Lee and Tony for sharing their insights and expertise with us today, and Todd for joining between your travel. It's we really appreciate your time and your participation, and we hope that everyone on the webinar found the session valuable. I do just want to repeat my earlier comment around a recording of the webinar will be shared with you, and if you don't receive it, you can reach out to the marketing team here at BSI. And we have shared the links like Todd shared into the chat, and we will also be including them in the communication to you with the recording so that you get them directly. Thank you again, and we look forward to welcoming you to another BSI webinar soon. Have a good day.